So back to the white blood cells, or the leukocytes. We're going to be looking at, again, the granulocytes, basophils, eosinophils, and neutrophils, and also the agranulocytes, the ones that don't really have granules that are a part of their function, the monocytes and lymphocytes. First, let's talk about just white blood cells or leukocytes in general. They come in many different varieties. They have incredible immune abilities. They're able to defend the body, protect it from infectious microorganisms called pathogens, and they can leave the blood and actually get into tissues where there is a site of infection via a process called diapedesis. Diapedesis is when circulating leukocytes leave the capillaries. They squeeze through the endothelial cells, the cells that make up blood vessels. They're actually attracted to specific stimuli secreted from neurons that monitor pain and also from dying or cells that are being taken over by things like pathogens. Now, all red blood cells and all white blood cells, even all platelets, are produced in the bone marrow. All cells come from the bone marrow. But white blood cells are the only complete cell. They have a nucleus, they have mitochondria, they have other organelles, and they're much larger than red blood cells. Now, most are phagocytic, and they have a lifespan that differs, some 12 hours, some several years, because there is such a thing as a memory white blood cell. And there's different types of white blood cells. I kind of already mentioned the granulocytes and agranulocytes. The granulocytes have granules that are part of their function, and the agranulocytes do not. A way to remember kind of the order, at least in abundance, for the white blood cells is to remember never let monkeys eat bananas because neutrophils are the most common, followed by lymphocytes, then monocytes, then eosinophils, then basophils. But these two types of leukocytes are going to be characterized based on the presence or absence of functional granules in their cytoplasm. Let's look at neutrophils first. We're going to start with the granulocytes. These are the most numerous type of leukocytes, also known as polymorphonuclear leukocytes, or PMNs. They do stain a light violet color, and they're called neutrophils because they absorb both acidic and basic stains, creating kind of that lighter purple granule color. They're multi-lobed when it comes to their nucleus, so they can have 4 to 6 lobes. They don't have multiple nuclei, they just have different parts of the nucleus. They are attracted to the site of injury, and they're great at ingesting and destroying bacteria. They usually actually go to the site of injury first, but they do die fighting. Their major mechanism of action, how they work, is they release their granules, which contain reactive oxidative species, and that's called a respiratory burst. And that helps break down bacteria and cell debris. Next, we're going to be looking at the eosinophil, but let's not leave the neutrophil alone just yet. So let's review. The neutrophil has light purple granules, 4 to 6 lobes, and a multi-lobed nucleus, and use a respiratory burst to help break down and phagocytose bacteria. All right, now the eosinophils, probably one of the easily recognizable types of white blood cells. Also a granulocyte, and its granules stain bright red. It also has a bilobed nucleus, so it should have 2 parts to its nucleus, and it can look anywhere kind of like earmuffs to an 8, but it plays a role in responding to allergic reactions. So usually during an allergic reaction, you would see an increase in number of eosinophils in the blood called eosinophilia. And they can also respond to infections caused by parasites and kind of coat and break down, especially parasitic worms. Now, they only compose about 1 to 4% of all white blood cells, but they're very distinctive. Here is an eosinophil in a microscope slide, and you can see here that it has 2 parts to its nucleus, and it has that kind of pink cytoplasm represented by its pink granules. But let's look at the last basophil, or last granulocyte, next. Basophils make up about 0.5% of all white blood cells, so it might be hard to find. They do have a U to kind of an S-shaped nucleus, but their granules are really going to be the star. They are dark purple staining granules, and they're so dark that they kind of obscure the nucleus. In these granules, though, you do have histamines, and they assist mast cells, which also release histamine, in the inflammation response. Basophils are primarily involved in the allergy and allergic response. That's because histamine is a vasodilator, and so it can dilate blood vessels and help other blood components, including other white blood cells, get to an injury or site of infection. So again, their granules stain dark blue purple, and the granules of basophils do release histamine. So here we can see a basophil in a microscope slide. And you can see it really looks like an amalgamation of dark purple dots. It does have a nucleus that's U or S shaped, but it's generally obscured. All right, so that's the granulocytes, but there are two agranulocytes. One, the second most numerous, white blood cell, the lymphocyte. It composes about 20 to 45% of white blood cells, and it's definitely the most important for the immune system. It's quite small here in this view. It's about the size of a red blood cell, just slightly larger, but it's really effective in fighting infectious organisms or fighting pathogens. It can actually change into either a T or B lymphocyte that has the ability to either attack foreign cells directly or multiply and become a plasma cell that secretes antibodies. T and B cells are both a part of our adaptive immune system, which is the specific part of our immune system that really goes after pathogens or things causing disease, specifically and with targeted effects. So keep in mind that lymphocytes here that we're going to be seeing in blood slides are kind of differentiated just to a certain extent. They're not yet kind of active T or B lymphocytes, but they can be. We also have kind of a large spherical nucleus for a lymphocyte, and it's large for the size of the cell. But you should still see a little bit of a lighter purple or a light blue piece of the cytoplasm that usually kind of looks like a crescent moon shape. So here we're seeing a lymphocyte. We can see a little bit of that crescent moon cytoplasm on the upper right, but mostly it has its spherical nucleus taking up most of the space. Just like lymphocytes, monocytes do not have active granules when it comes to their functions. And whereas lymphocytes are the smallest white blood cell, monocytes are the biggest white blood cell. They compose only about 4 to 8% of white blood cells, so the third most common, but still not a lot. They are also going to have anywhere from a U to a kidney shaped nucleus. And they're able to transform once they move into tissue into something called a macrophage, which are very active phagocytes, even more so than neutrophils. But neutrophils arrive first, and then macrophages arrive second. Macrophages are better than neutrophils at being phagocytosis, or performing, I should say, phagocytosis. They're going to be able to work over and over again versus constantly dying fighting. All right, so here's a monocyte. So you can see it's in the blood here, so it's being called a monocyte. After a couple of hours, once it leaves the blood and moves into tissue, it would be called a macrophage. So here's a good review slide to look at our three granulocytes, neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, and our two agranulocytes, lymphocyte and a monocyte. And it shows you kind of the general information about their nucleus and their function and what they look like. All right, next we're going to be looking at thrombocytes. Thrombocytes are also known as platelets. They are really just cell fragments made up of breaking down a giant cell called a megakaryocyte. Megakaryocytes can't leave the red bone marrow, but they can kind of essentially be shaved off into small pieces, and those pieces, the platelets, can enter the blood. What's inside of a platelet is clotting factors like calcium, ADP, serotonin, and that's why platelets function in blood clotting. Stopping bleeding is a process called hemostasis, and part of that is forming a platelet plug. So platelets have to release chemicals so they can both stick to a torn vessel wall and also make other platelets sticky, which initiates a positive feedback cycle. Now, positive feedback cycles in the body have to be very locally regulated because the cycle has to stop when the stimulus disappears, or else this amplifying process that is a positive feedback cycle can get out of control. So now we've looked at the composition of whole blood. We've talked about plasma and what's within it, including the plasma proteins. We've talked about red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, white blood cells, also called leukocytes, and platelets, also known as thrombocytes, and looked at their many different functions, like red blood cells and their oxygen carrying capacity, the ability to provide immune functioning from white blood cells, and help with blood clotting from platelets. And so a summary of formed elements is here. And you can find this table also in your lecture textbook. But again, it's just going through the basic information, but this time not just from white blood cells, also about red blood cells and platelets. And remember that all of these components, all of these formed elements are cellular components. Only the white blood cells are complete cells, but they're still all cellular components, and they come from the red bone marrow. That's where blood cell generation, called hematopoiesis, takes place. So there is a blood stem cell in the red bone marrow called the hematopoietic stem cell that gives rise to early blood cells. The first early blood cells are the lymphoid and myeloid stem cells, and the lymphoid stem cell really only gives rise to lymphocytes, whereas the myeloid stem cell gives rise to all other blood cells. But it's important to know kind of this basic outline that all blood cells come from the red bone marrow, from an original stem cell, and then they differentiate into two different types of stem cells that give rise to the rest. Next, we're going to be talking more about the discovery of blood groups and get a little bit more into blood typing, including the ABO blood types.